Only on Telesur, the news source from South America and the Caribbean.
From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I am Saini Gray. In Brazil, the leaders of the Workers' Party, PT, are meeting in Sao Paulo to decide on their strategy after the Supreme Court rejected former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's Habeas Corpus petition to avoid imprisonment. In an official statement, the Workers' Party said that today is a tragic day for democracy in Brazil. According to the party, the court denied Lula the right to defense. It also accuses the Brazilian media company O Globo of influencing the decision. The PT intends to keep Lula as their presidential candidate until the Electoral Court rules otherwise. And our correspondent in Brasilia, Adriana Rebreño, has more on the Supreme Court's decision.
The Brazilian Supreme Federal Tribunal has decided to deny former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva his request of habeas corpus. The vote was 6-5 against the former president's request. The Supreme Court's decision has been considered historic in the country, as many say it goes against Article 5 in the Constitution, which says citizens are presumed innocent until proven otherwise, and that they can appeal a court's decision while remaining free. With this decision, the Supreme Court is denying Lula this right. Now the former president has to face an imprisonment order that could become effective at any time. Lula was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The Supreme Court decision is considered by many to be divisive and damaging to democracy, especially as it follows the impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff in 2016.
Lula's supporters took to the streets in the Brazilian city of Brasilia in response to the ruling.
Protesters arrived in Brasilia from all over the country. They marched downtown in support of former President Lula da Silva, as the Supreme Federal Court decided on his habeas corpus petition.
I came to Brasilia because I think it's an injustice to punish a president who did so much for Brazil. I personally benefit from his social housing program. We cannot let him be sent to jail.
This is an injustice, and I think it's more of a political decision than anything else.
With a 6-5 decision, judges decided to deny habeas corpus to the former president and to ignore Article 5 of the Constitution, which guarantees citizens' innocence until proven guilty.
This defeat means that the Supreme Federal Court simply disregarded our Constitution. We have entered an incredibly difficult time for our democracy. At this point, anything could happen. We must continue to fight.
Protesters on the streets believe this decision proves Brazil is living under a state of emergency.
This decision means the Supreme Federal Court is part of a coup, and the declaration by the commander of the armed force, in which he threatened Lula, proves that the military is involved.
Although this habeas corpus denial is a defeat, for social movements, the political and judicial fight in defense of Lula will go on.
Leaders of the left in Brazil and around the world have also condemned the ruling against Lula. The Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, sent a message of support to Lula. This injustice pains us deeply, he wrote. The right has chosen to use the courts to frighten the people, but they will not succeed. While Ecuador's former president, Rafael Correa, said, "We all know your crime was to lift 38 million Brazilians out of poverty." And the leader of the French left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, tweeted, "What a rotten world. Lula is condemned to 12 years to prevent him from being a candidate, while Macron welcomes the Venezuelan right." But despite the Brazilian Supreme Court decision, Lula still has a chance to avoid prison. He has until next Tuesday to file a final appeal to the Porto Alegre Regional Court. This is one of Lula's best hopes to avoid a 12-year sentence for corruption. But there are also 3 other options available to him. Lula's defense can file a new writ of habeas corpus. His sentence could be overturned by a higher court. The federal Supreme Court could modify its position on retrials after conviction for all inmates in Brazil, which would also benefit Lula. Other news now. Venezuela has signed a bilateral agreement with South Africa to develop commercial ties in education, tourism, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and culture. Venezuela's Minister of Foreign Trade, José Gregorio Vilma, said on Twitter that both nations are developing investment ties using the country's cryptocurrency, the petro. Vilma added that together, Venezuela and South Africa will defeat any economic sanctions. And in Bolivia, families of the victims from the massacre of 2003 celebrated the verdict from the U.S. jury, which found the leaders of that country at the time guilty.
Families of the victims of the October 2003 massacre were relieved at the decision from the United States Federal Court against Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada and his former Minister of Defense, Carlos Sánchez Berzaín.
We have caught up with Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada in a place where he thought he wasn't going to be found.
We have fought for 15 years, but it wasn't in vain. I have 7 children, and I have had to be a mother and a father to them because my husband was murdered in the massacre.
The ruling was issued by a civil trial by a federal court near Miami, where Sánchez de Lozada and Sánchez Berzaín faced the victims' families for the first time.
What's important is that a jury has said that they are responsible of the massacre. We achieved what we were looking for, and that can't be changed. We got justice today in the United States. The whole world knows that they are human rights violators.
The defense of the accused appealed against the verdict straight away and asked for its annulment. According to the plaintiffs, progress has been made, but the fight is not over.
They're resorting to a legal appeal. Then they can present a request to the United States Supreme Court of Justice. There are still things they can do.
2 extradition processes presented by Bolivia's foreign ministry were rejected by the United States, where the government protects accused politicians. The families trust this verdict will smooth the process for extradition.
Our goal is for them to go to jail. Every murder must be locked up.
He didn't want to get caught. We all know that. He's been running all over the world.
In October 2003, people gathered in the city of El Alto to reject the government's proposal to export natural gas. The protest was violently repressed for several days, with a total of 67 deaths and 400 injured. Sánchez de Lozada resigned and fled to the United States with his ministers.
We're going to take a short break, but join us again after a look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. The peace talks between the Colombian government and the ELN continue in Quito, Ecuador. Our correspondent Denise Herrera has more.
The fifth round of peace talks between the Colombian government and the National Liberation Army, or ELN, continues. During this week, the Colombian government and the ELN discussed one of the first points of the peace talks, which was to renew the bilateral ceasefire. This evaluation also called with the support of the United Nations and the Colombian Catholic Church. Also, the chief negotiator of the new political party, FARC, arrived in Quito to discuss about the situation. He announced he will continue fighting to preserve the peace in the border with the ELN. This conversation will continue private, so it's all for now. We will keep you posted with more information as soon as we can. Back to you at the studio.
In the midst of endless murders of social leaders in Colombia, 500 organizations have announced a report on the complex human rights situation in that country.
Social organizations from all over the country published a report on the issue of human rights, prepared for an evaluation process to be submitted to the UN by the Colombian state on May 10th.
Colombia unfortunately has failed on human rights, and we say this sadly because the peace process, the peace agreement with FARC and the start of negotiations with the ELN guerrillas should have given us the possibility of improving the human rights situation and to begin to build a stable and lasting peace. But there continue to be situations that the Colombian state has not been able or has not been willing to overcome in the field of human rights.
Between 2013 and 2017, at least 266 murders and 664 attacks against human rights defenders were registered.
If we review the moment and the place where these killings happened, then it is possible to identify a pattern in the way these murders took place and the motivation behind them.
Human rights supporters are in danger all over the country.
If you are a supporter in Cauca or in Choco, you will definitely be at risk because you are facing off against illegal mining projects or the big mining companies that are affecting the environment and natural resources.
2005's Law of Justice and Peace, promoted by the government of Álvaro Uribe and meant to facilitate the demobilization of paramilitaries, has had zero results after 13 years.
There was enough evidence gathered on third-party liability for the justice and peace trial of businessmen, of civil authorities, of military authorities. And now, in 2018, we still don't know the actions brought against these businessmen and against these authorities that were incriminated by the paramilitaries as being involved in crimes.
After so many murders and violence, the Colombian state should start guaranteeing the lives of social leaders and their communities.
Also in Colombia, authorities have asked the Mining and Environmental Control Body to analyze the environmental impact of the oil spill in the northeast region of Santander. The decision was made after evidence of failings by the Colombian oil company Ecopetrol between 2013 and 2017. The control body warned Ecopetrol of issues in relation to the abandonment, inactivity, and suspension of wells. On March 2nd, an oil spill in the La Lizama well devastated the surrounding natural area. The Colombian government has asked the United Nations for help to clean the area affected by the oil spill. The Minister of Environment, Luis Gilberto Murillo, requested UN assistance for the recovery of the area in the northeast municipality of Barrancaña Bermeja. U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an order to deploy the National Guard to the border with Mexico. Trump's decision comes after his complaint against a caravan of hundreds of Central American migrants heading to the United States. The number of soldiers to be sent to the Mexican border is yet to be determined. Following Trump's announcement, the Mexican president, Enrique Pena Nieto, said that his government is awaiting clarification from Washington before giving a proper response.
It hasn't happened yet, but if that will happen, then Mexico will outline its position. Hopefully, the clarification will arrive soon, so we can orientate our position regarding Trump's decision to militarize the border.
Social organizations in Mexico have denounced that a multi-million-dollar budget assigned to combat poverty is allegedly being used by the government for the electoral campaigns.
Pedro has to bring water from miles away in order to prepare some tea. In the Tebajanes, where he has lived for over 20 years, there is no gas delivery, electricity, or drainage system. Many presidential candidates have offered help. Pedro doesn't believe in their promises.
The poor have never been taken into account, quite the opposite. They only take into account those who have money.
Nonetheless, the government has announced it will assign millions to fight poverty, but economist Arturo Huerte doubts the budget will be properly applied.
These resources could be used to develop agriculture, to generate employment. People want jobs, not misery.
The Secretariat of Social Development, which is in charge of social development efforts in the country, was managed by candidate José Antonio Meade.
It's difficult to help those in need, as we managed to do in Cedasol, when 2 million Mexicans were taken out of extreme poverty.
Meade says he has reduced extreme poverty rates under the current government, but official numbers don't back him up. In the last 25 years, the number of people living in poverty has actually increased. It's being calculated that there are more than 60 million Mexicans living in poverty, even though the official budget to combat the issue has tripled during the same period.
In a historic win in Costa Rica, a pro-gay marriage vice president, Epsi Campbell-Barr, fought off opposition from an evangelical right-wing candidate. In an exclusive interview, Vice President-elect Epsi Campbell-Barr spoke to Telesur about the results.
It was a very important debate because in Costa Rica we were for the first time in history facing a religious party that had set out a number of issues which could have directly affected and violated the rights of the LGBTI population. Not only this, but in Costa Rica there has long been a bond between religion and politics, and during the debates their religious party pushed a political ethic based on a Christian neo-Pentecostal ethic.
In Guatemala, the Supreme Court of Justice has refused to withdraw presidential immunity from the country's leader, Jimmy Morales. Morales is under scrutiny for his alleged responsibility in the deaths of 41 girls who lost their lives when a state home burned down in March 2017. The spokesman of the court, Angel Pineda, said that the plenary found the complaint lodged against the president to be political and spurious. At least 3 people were wounded after police in the Argentinian province of Jujuy attacked a demonstration of workers, teachers, and students. Police officers threw tear gas and rubber bullets at demonstrators. They were calling for salary rights as employees and demonstrating against the government's austerity measures. Argentina's Football Association says it will monitor boarding houses where young players live. This is following a sex scandal involving minors at 2 of the country's most popular soccer clubs, River Plate and Independiente. Buenos Aires Attorney General Julio Contegran is also looking into the matter. He says in several cases, young boys were offered public transportation cards, among other things, in exchange for sexual favors. He added that the number of victims may increase as the investigation continues.
There are at least 10 more possible victims, but we won't stop at that. We will continue to investigate, as there may be more victims.
We're going to take another break, but join us again after another look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting.
enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country.
As we came, we saw, he died.
Welcome. I think we are ready to start. Welcome to this
Welcome back. The daughter of the former Russian double agent Yulias is reported to have issued a statement about her condition from the hospital where she's recovering. The statement comes exactly 1 month after the pair was found unconscious on a bench in Salisbury. Pablo Navarrete brings us more on that from London.
Today, Thursday, via an interview by a relative of Julia Skripal, the daughter of the former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal, in an interview with the British newspaper The Guardian, this relative, Victoria Skripal, announced that she had spoken to Yulia and that she was doing well. In addition, she, in this interview, which is the first public declarations of Julia Skripal since the poisoning of Julia and her father, Sergei Skripal, in the British city of Salisbury on the 4th of March. In this interview by her relative, she says that Julia is doing well and that her father is resting and sleeping. In addition, this relative, Victoria Skripal, has said that she has been in contact with the Russian embassy and is planning a trip to Britain to bring Julia home. In other major developments in the Skripal case, the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has been receiving widespread criticism for an interview he gave to a German broadcaster in which he categorically said that the scientists at Portendown, the chemical warfare research unit of the British Ministry of Defence, that scientists at Portendown had assured him that the origin of the nerve agent used to poison Sergei and Julia was Russian. In an interview 2 days ago by the chief executive of Portendown, he did not give the assurances that the nerve agent was Russian. He said that they could not prove 100% that that was the case. So this discrepancy between what Boris Johnson has said and what the chief executive of Portendown has opened up calls for Boris Johnson's resignation. However, in the independent media in Britain, there have been criticisms of the mainstream media, particularly the BBC, for not leading sufficiently with this story. These are the major developments in the Skripal case today, Thursday, from London. Back to the studio.
In another development in that spy poisoning row, Russia has lost a bid for a joint investigation with Britain at the global chemical weapons watchdog, the OPCW, in The Hague. Russia's ambassador to Britain says Moscow would accept the results of the test by the international chemical weapons inspectors in the UK, but only if the process was transparent.
As far as the results, of course we'll accept the results, but these results should be confirmed by the international community. So we want to see who were the experts. For the time being, we don't know who were the experts.
Julius Maada Bio, an opposition candidate and former military junta leader, has been sworn in as Sierra Leone's new president. Maada Bio, a former military leader, took over 51% of the votes against close rival Samura Kamara of the ruling party. Maada Bio served as the head of a military regime in 1996. After taking the oath, he said he will promote national unity and disciplined leadership. In a new disclosure, Facebook says the privacy of more than 87 million users was compromised by the British data mining company Cambridge Analytica. The figure was reported to be 50 million a week ago. But Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg says a search feature on Facebook that enabled people to extract information was misused. Zuckerberg will answer questions at an inquiry at the U.S. House Committee on Emergency and Commerce next week. In Syria, two brothers are restoring an Aleppo church to its former glory. The Catholic building was partially destroyed during the ongoing civil war. Nimat and Bashir Badawi set themselves a 100-day deadline to complete their mission of painstakingly repairing iconic murals. They're now working on the Assumption of Mary, which shows the Virgin Mary ascending to heaven, surrounded by angels. Aleppo is in the process of returning to normal after being liberated from the Islamic State. And that story has brought us to the end of the newscast. But for these and many other stories, you can always find them on our website at talisyourtv.net/English. You can also join us on social media on Facebook, on Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Sunny Gray. Thank you so much for watching.